So it's my pleasure to introduce Lindsay Clandfield. Let's give him a big hand, please. Thank you.
Okay, first of all, thank you for the introduction, Marcos. One thing you left out of the introduction that I'm going to say now is I'm a man, Lindsay, because lots of times people meet me and they're like, I thought Lindsay, it's a woman's name, but I'm one of the few men Lindsays. I'm originally from Canada. I currently teach and I train teachers in Spain. And I also write materials, write textbooks, methodology books, and then strange books like books about zombies and aliens and things like that. I'd also like to thank JALT for inviting me here, and thank, again, just as my fellow plenary speaker did this morning, thank you for coming to this talk and this event. It's my first time in Japan. It's my first time at JALT, so I'm very happy to be here. Okay, I'd like to start. My talk is going to be about inclusion, diversity, the themes of this conference within the prism of ELT materials. Okay, so I want to start by asking you to put yourselves in the position of that most villainous of characters in our profession, the textbook writer. Okay, so I want you to imagine that I'm going to put a couple of situations to you. I want you to imagine that you need to create materials, and I'm going to give you a question about each of these. Okay, you might not think you might not think of yourself as a textbook writer. Think then of yourself as making materials for other teachers. This could be an exam at your university. It could be a worksheet that other teachers will use. Okay? All right, the first one that I want you to think of is, well, I'll ask you to choose one of these. The first one is a conversation between two people at a cafe. You need to write a dialogue between two people at a cafe, and it's about small talk. So my question to you is, what would be one or two of the useful phrases of small talk at a B1 level in that dialogue? So the thing that they have to learn is sort of expressions for small talk. That's one possibility. Second possibility, let me come to these, okay? I want you to imagine that you're making a worksheet or a piece of material to teach professions. I'm going to give you some professions there. Which of these do you think are easier to illustrate with clip art or with other kinds of art? Pilot, accountant, doctor, architect. I want you to think which of those are easier to illustrate and what would the illustration look like. And then the third option, you only choose one of these. The third option is I want you to imagine you're making some materials for A1 level, beginner students, on the family, okay? And just off the top of your head, I want you to brainstorm 5 or 6, 7 words, let's say, that you would teach and how those would go together, okay? Like, would you do a family tree or something like that? Remember, this wouldn't be something where you could necessarily talk about your own family. It would be making something to teach that other teachers could use, all right? So please, let's start off our plenary here by I'm going to ask you to do something, because I'm a teacher after all, so I can't resist getting people to do things. And I want you to choose one of these with the person next to you, just one, and brainstorm. And I'm going to give you a strict time limit. Just 1 minute to brainstorm ideas. We're not going to do feedback because there's another part coming afterwards. Okay? Choose one, 1 minute, go. Okay, stop there. As I said, I'm not going to do feedback on this. There are too many of you. But now I'm going to ask the follow-up question. How many of you, just quick show of hands, we're talking about the first one, the couple in the cafe. Okay. My first question is, you were imagining a couple, what they were saying, okay? Now just think of what your answers to this, okay? What age were those two people? What accent were they speaking in? Was it two men, two women, a man and a woman? What color skin did they have? That's my first one, okay? Second thing, pilot, accountant, doctor, architect. How many people were talking about this one? By the way, if any of you have a really good idea on how you can illustrate an accountant, I want to talk to you afterwards. Because all those office jobs look the same in the clip art. But my other question is, what were the gender of these people while you were thinking of those jobs? What were the gender of those people? When you were thinking of a pilot, were you thinking of a man? Were you thinking of a woman? What was the thing going through your mind? Okay? I'm not going to ask you to share it with everybody. Just reflect. This tags back onto something that happened in this morning's plenary. And finally, when you're thinking of family vocabulary, remembering that you can't, obviously as a teacher, if you're teaching family vocabulary, the easiest thing to reach for, if you're not using materials, is your own family to teach, or a student's family. But if you're making materials, you have to decide on a family. And so my question was, of those words, were they the typical nuclear family? Was that what you were thinking? Were you thinking of a family tree with a mother, a father, a son, and a daughter, and a brother or sister, so that we can get all those key words? Did anyone start thinking about, well, what happens, do we have an ex, or a half-brother, or etc.? These are the kinds of questions that often materials writers begin to wrestle with, be it a textbook writer, or if you're creating a test, or things like that, that inevitably bring up issues of diversity and inclusion, okay? And I think this activity, what I was trying to do, hopefully it wasn't too obvious, was trying to access, by asking you to think about something else, access perhaps some of the implicit biases that we all have. So when you were thinking of the clip art of the pilot, if you were like, well, that's easy to illustrate, it's a guy with a hat. The implicit bias there is that we were thinking first of the man for the pilot, or the doctor as the man, etc. Yeah? The implicit bias of two people having a conversation in English, and the small talk stuff would be two people speaking with an English accent or an American accent. Maybe a man and a woman, probably young. Or at least these are the implicit biases that I recognize myself when I'm creating these situations. We're going to come back to those. I had other possible titles I wanted to give this talk, because I think a lot of, when we're talking about in materials, the issues of diversity and inclusion, it's all about the real world as well. And so this has always been, I think, a tension within English language teaching materials. So I wondered if another title of this talk could be something, Depicting the Real World. How do we depict the real world? Then I thought, actually, it's more problems like the real problem with the real world. And then I thought, it's something like this is what often people think of as English language teaching materials. Which brings the third part of my original title, which wasn't on the first slide, but the idea of authenticity. So a lot of the time in English language teaching, the real world comes across often as a buzz term, certainly for materials. We want materials that help prepare students for the real world. Now, how can this be interpreted? And I've identified several ways that the real world is interpreted and put forth in materials, and then how it is marketed. The materials are marketed as being useful for the real world. How do publishers and authors like myself market those? And then what are the problems of that in terms of diversity and inclusion? So I'm going to go through those. Does that sound okay? Yes, of course. I don't know why I asked that. If it didn't sound okay, too bad. That's what's happening. Okay, so we're going to start with inclusion and diversity in English and in tasks. Okay, so the English that we teach and the tasks that we ask students to do. Then we're going to move on to the much trickier topic of inclusion and diversity in the topics that we teach in via our materials, the people and culture. Okay? And finally, look at challenges and perhaps solutions, not sure. So the first area that is probably the easiest area to go to for materials writing, and I'm talking here about textbooks often, because that's my background, is more textbooks, is the idea we are teaching real-world language and tasks. But let's start with real-world language, okay? Nobody wants to write a textbook that says this is a lot of unreal language in here. That may be useful for your English, but it's just kind of unreal. We all want to be real-world English. Now, the way that this has been marketed has changed over the years, as I think English has become more recognized as an international language, and textbooks have had to change along with that. Originally, when I started teaching in the 90s, the idea of real English was, and the kind of things that I would say, well, I'm teaching you real English, the English you hear on the street. Obviously, there I was thinking on the street in my country, in Canada, okay? Or the English the way people really speak it, okay? Or the things that native speakers, which has become a very loaded term, the things that native speakers really say. So often when talking about like English that we're teaching or in materials, they used to have like, this is how native speakers really say it. This is real, it's the real world. And most often, that meant two major varieties of English. American English and British English was the easiest ways of sort of dividing those. We kind of had those two. This is familiar to everyone here, these kind of terms and these expressions. Sorry, again, lots of text here, but from a really great book on the history of English language teaching, the idea that real or authentic language is a very, very powerful kind of marketing message, okay? Nobody wants to say that they are teaching unreal English. So it also tends to be presupposed on the authority of linguists and of textbook writers and so on, that we are delivering real English. Recently, this has become even more real. So you will often see now, it's not enough that we're saying on books now, it's real world English. We need to scientifically prove it, okay? And our tools for doing that now is that we are informed by a corpus, and that it's almost like we're trying to sell it as a scientific method. Like we have proof, the statistical proof that this is real world English. Here are two tools that are increasingly being used by materials writers in my context. They're freely available to teachers as well, but in certainly the last 2 or 3 textbook projects I've been involved with in mainstream, Zombies was not part of this, was either the Pearson Global Scale of English or English Profile, which is the Cambridge project, which have handy databases that you can search, and they will tell you the level of the word, and they will kind of give you that kind of data on it. Oops. All right. Here, every once in a while in this talk, what I wanted to do is have little moments where I get you to buzz to each other, okay? So I can drink some water, and it's a little bit more interactive, okay? So anytime we see yellow, that's a point where I'm going to ask you to do something. So here, another 30-second buzz. Of these words here, which of the following is more frequent, do you think? Okay? Which of those things are more frequent? All right? 45 seconds, go. Okay. Many of you, I won't go through one of them one at a time. It's the second column that, according to the corpus that I was given at the time, which was a corpus owned by Macmillan Publishing, this was the data that we were, part of the things that we were given, that the second column were the more frequent ones, okay? But, and yes, you may all be saying, oh, I'm not really sure, but that underlines another problem with the corpus in the real world English is which corpus do we choose, okay? So if this is a corpus mostly of British English, is it mostly of American English? There are corpuses of non-native speaker English. So the more, it depends on the kind of corpus you choose and how much diversity we want in that corpus then to make those judgments. So are we getting a diversity of English in our materials, or are we still using like British English as is spoken in Britain and American English as is spoken in America? Should there be more diversity, and there'll be lots of kind of rhetorical questions from me to you about this to think about, should there be more diversity in our teaching materials, textbooks, etc., of non-standard speech? Let's even just stick with British and American English in kind of very big terms. Should any of these things be in materials? Okay, so these are kind of more modern, I reached for slightly more modern non-standard forms, which you'll often see on the internet or in chats or things like that. So at what point, this is one of the things that when you're making textbooks or materials or exams, at what point, where do you draw the line on standard and non-standard forms? How much diversity are we prepared to accept in terms of materials, okay? I leave this as a question to you for your own choice here. But obviously, it's not just those two standards. Are we going to go into diversity in varieties of English? Are we going to include other varieties of quote-unquote native speaker English, Australian, New Zealand, South African, Indian, Scottish, Canadian, etc.? That's not even to get started on varieties of non-native English. Now, this is an area where I think textbooks have started to make more changes, especially in the last 20 years. We are beginning to see a little bit more of a flexibility and relaxing on a diversity of English. How is this happening? Some steps that have been taken in some textbooks, and again, I'm not very familiar with the specific textbooks in Japan. Afterwards, you can tell me if this is happening with your textbooks. We're beginning to see more unscripted, authentic recordings, which are now increasingly including a balance of native and non-native speakers. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking of a myth, well, it wasn't a myth, it was true, of that the accents on the course, on the textbooks, were often done by someone pretending to be French or pretending to be German or pretending. So this was often, and that was the case in the past. Due to a variety of constraints, they would have a limited amount of actors and they wanted to have accents, so they would say to the actor, well, can you do this in a kind of Japanese accent? And so on. But teachers are increasingly seeing through this now. And I hear it all the time where they're like, I don't like hearing somebody pretending to be something else. That is improving. We are getting more listenings now where it is authentic non-native speakers. It makes the writing of the material a bit more challenging, but that's beginning to come in. Let me just give you an example. Oops. Oh, well, let's see if this works. I'm not going to give you an example. It's not working. The idea is that there are more and more examples now in textbooks where you will have a variety of accents. They are still all intelligible. One of the things I noticed as a writer being in the studio when they get people to come and do these is that often the person, because they're an actor living in Britain or in America, they don't really have as strong an accent as the writer wants them to have. And so you get someone that like, they sound quite British, and you're like, well, can you try to sound a bit more, you know, whatever French or whatever you were? That doesn't always happen. So often you get that more authentic sound. Okay. Oops. Oh, great. Hold on a second. Okay. Just a moment. All right. The next thing that I wanted to address is the idea, so we've looked at language and the problems of diversity in the varieties that we speak, the challenges you might have of varieties, accents, and so on. The next really big issue that we often deal with in materials is the idea of real-world tasks, okay? So this is often sold as the English you need for the real world, or useful English, or everyday English, or real-world English, or real-life English, okay? And it's often in the context of kind of traveling around and encountering people in English out in the real world. So, next question is yellow again, so it's back over to you. Which of the following would you consider real-world tasks, okay? All right. Which of these do you think are real-world tasks? Okay. I have an idea of which ones you probably identified as more typically real world, okay? So my follow-up questions, in what situations do those real world, and I'm imagining that you were thinking things like making a reservation, writing a comment on a website, or asking for directions, are probably the principal ones. In what situations do these real world tasks usually appear? And a lot of them tend to be, certainly at lower levels, service encounters, right? So shopping or making a reservation or you're meeting someone. In the service encounters, what role is the learner cast in? Are they cast in the person giving the service, or are they cast as the person asking for the service? And what assumptions are we making about learners here? And here we get to the idea of diversity and including different kinds of learners. Because a lot has been written on this, of the kind of assumptions that are made in textbooks about what learners are being cast as. Okay? It's often aspirational, and the situations are often kind of travel-related and so forth. By the way, I am speaking of general English mostly. Obviously, if you're teaching English for specific purposes, it might be different. One question that's been asked before is, are we teaching learners to be good users of English or good global consumers? In the sense that we're always getting them to make reservations, to shop, to stay in hotels, to complain about something in a hotel, etc., and so on and so forth. This is one thing that I wrestled with myself teaching in Mexico, where the part of Mexico I was teaching, the learners were never going to go out and be on that side of the equation. They were on the other side. So in fact, the language that they probably needed more was the other side of the service encounter. Yeah? Even though they were partly doing it, the main stuff that we were teaching, or the material that I was using, was more like, you are traveling to another country now, you are doing this, you are getting on a plane, and so on and so forth. So it's often travel, business, and it tends to make an assumption, I believe, that the learner is of a certain social class and a certain amount of money, that they can afford to go to restaurants, that they actually would complain in a restaurant or complain in a hotel about the service, which is definitely not true of everyone. A really difficult book to read if you're a textbook reader, because it makes you feel pretty awful, but it's a great book by John Gray, The Construction of English, where he analyzes a lot of the textbooks and comes up with some very damning conclusions about what we are doing in English language textbooks. He talks about them being how discourses of feminism, multiculturalism, globalization are co-opted to inscribe English with values that include individualism, egalitarianism, cosmopolitanism, mobility, and affluence. And that's the last one I was talking about, affluence, in which students are increasingly addressed as consumers. Okay? So several people have written about this and talked about this in the world of critiquing English language textbooks. Back over to you, another 30 seconds. I'm looking at the time here. What kind of real-world tasks and real-world English would you include in a course if you wanted to provide more diversity? Okay? Can you just think of one real-world task that isn't traditionally taught? If you wanted to include more diversity, what kinds of things would you include? Okay? I'm going to give you 40 seconds for this. Go. Okay, your 40 seconds is up. You can imagine what I'm like as a teacher, huh? Okay, here I did this thought experiment with a group of Spanish teachers. And some interesting things came up. I'm just going to share a couple of them with you. I thought they were interesting functional language things that I hadn't thought of putting in a course book. I thought might be interesting. What to do if you're stopped by the police in an English-speaking country. Certainly, you know, that would be a situation that I'd want to know some language. How to brush off an unwanted advance. How to express condolences to someone. We'll come back to this in topics, how ELT textbooks like to stay safe. We avoid things like death. How to confront a racist or xenophobic comment. So these are all ones, now, I don't know whether they would be able to fly in mainstream materials, but they're not the kind of things that are. Again, these aren't ones that I'm saying are necessarily good or we have to. I'm just saying, when faced with this is what other teachers were saying, oh, this would be interesting, or these are things that have come up. We get to finally, and I only have a certain amount of time, so I can't go really into depth of this, because this is the area of textbooks I think that has been most studied, is the idea of what real-world topics, people, and culture we talk about. I tried to find a recent study done on Japanese textbooks by a Japanese scholar. This is Ibata, based in Vancouver. She'd done a survey of several Japanese textbooks and found that the language was still increasingly viewed as being owned by native speakers, particularly from the US, Canada, Australia. So it was independent of any Japanese social or cultural influences. Whether or not it should have those or not, that's a different conversation. She was just saying that it is still, the important thing here, it still seemed to be owned by BANA, British, America, North America, and Australian cultures. So the topics, in old-fashioned topics, I think, in books 20 years ago when I started teaching, if I was teaching British English, I would have British English culture. Yeah, they would learn, maybe our family vocabulary would be based on the royal family. We would have a thing on Oxford Street. We would have a unit. There would be different things based on British. If I was teaching American English textbooks from 20 years ago, there would be maybe a lesson on the American system of government. There would be kind of a text about famous Americans, or etc. As course books have become more international, there's been an increasing rush away from this. So I don't think we see so much in international books, especially for universities, we don't see so much of this anymore, okay? Publishers have moved on. And so there are topics that I once did a survey of a whole bunch of adult topics, of course books, as part of research, and identified 10 international, popular, safe topics in ELT materials. You can tell me if you recognize any of these. Mobile phones is constantly being done. That's an endless source of lessons. The internet, anything about the internet, social networking, so on and so forth. As I'm going through these, think of the last time you saw this in materials. Traditions around the world. So whereas materials, they wanted to be more diverse, but we can't just have Britain, so we'll have like sort of New Year's in different countries, or whatever festival of love in different countries, and you might have a text of several countries. Health memes, I call them, so these are texts about food, like smart food, or diets, or sleeping, or water, all kind of safe things to a extent. Urban life, traffic, nightlife, etc. Celebrity lifestyle is a big one as well. Success stories. Lots of lifestyle and cosmopolitan-style questionnaires on safe topics. Robots, I've seen as often being one. Twins is another one, often used with so am I, neither am I. And busting stereotypes, often in the context of not all English people drink tea, not all English people do the crossword, not all English people do that. So that's appeared in several ones. Of course, the other issue with all of this, underpinning all of this, especially in more recent books, has been criticism of the use of images, the lack of diversity in images in our material. And I set a lot of this down to something that happened more recently in publishing, is stock photography. So websites like Getty Images, iStockPhoto, iPhoto, you know these websites, these stock photography websites are the ones that publishers go to, but they're also the ones that advertising companies go to, that brochures go to, and so on and so forth. So the styles of images often are purposely for advertising type things, which is why we get things that seem really airbrushed, that seem very sort of, often it's very white, but when it's not white, as I'm talking about race here, it sometimes seems a bit tokenistic. It's often quite wealthy. If you have a picture of a kitchen, when I'm teaching in Spain and teaching kitchen vocabulary with material, nobody in my class has a kitchen that looks as nice as the kitchen in the course book. It would cost enormous amounts of money. The houses look nice. All of this stuff is part of the problem of all of us using the same stock images. Okay, and that's for other reasons. They often have deals, the publishers, with stock image companies. It's cheaper, and so on. So moving away from taking our own photos and putting in it, we get this problem where we have a lack of diversity in images, or a sense of tokenism. Coming up towards the end, diversity of topics. This here is an image. You know what this is? Parsnips. Some of you may know what this refers to in the world of textbooks. Does anyone know what this refers to in the world of textbooks? One or two. These are the things that we are told, I've been told on at least 3 occasions as an author by publishers, that it's safer not to include these things. And so each letter of parsnips represents one of these things. So, for example, the P is for politics. We avoid politics. So A is for alcohol. Think about what the next one is, R. Religion, S. Oh, I went really quickly there. Sex, okay? No one has sex in ELT textbooks. They don't pray, and they don't have a beer. They used to. If you see books from the 80s, people were always having beers or a glass of wine or opening champagne. Now everyone has tea or coffee. Narcotics, well, duh, obviously, if we're not going to have beer, we're not going to have anything else. The I is isms, so you don't get a text on the history of feminism or socialism or communism or things like that. And the final P is pork, because of cultural reasons being sold into markets where pork is considered a no food, is considered dirty. So these are, and often people rail about this saying, oh, we should have all of these things. This will provide more diversity. This is a topic for another talk. I think there are some good reasons not to include some of these things. I think there are also not so good reasons, and there's often fear of a book not selling because it's considered too edgy or has gone into taboo areas. Nevertheless, this is a thing. It does exist. We're not supposed to do these things. Which sometimes leads me also to a question. Is it more important, and I don't have the answer, I'm still wrestling with this, so if you find me at the Best of JALT event tonight, tell me what you think. Is it more important, the responsibility of someone creating materials, to depict the world as we think it really is? Or do we have a responsibility to depict it as we wish it to be? So, and this is often comes to questions of what do we include, what do we not include, in terms of, well, that's not realistic in this culture, but should we be depicting it because it's something we think we should be moving towards? The first area we often talk about this is in gender roles in jobs. So women pilots represent 4%, I checked, of world pilots. So if I have a book and I put a picture of a pilot as a woman, I'm making a decision there to be diverse. But now am I being real world? I'm talking kind of like arguing against myself here. Challenges that occur with diversity, real world, inclusion in the classroom, I think are multiple, okay? One of the first things is level, okay? So often with some of these topics and some of the varieties of English, it's very easy to spiral out of level. So it becomes more difficult. The more diversity in certain kinds of topics and so on can make it become harder. Same things with English and those non-standard versions of English or other varieties of English can suddenly make it seem harder. Sometimes it's messy because I think all of us as teachers know, and those of us who read on second language acquisition know, but we all just know that language is not neat, tidy, things that you can just, it becomes messy. And the more we start including other things, the more chance it is to become messy. And one of the things when making materials is there's an urge to try to make it as simple and clear as possible to teach from. So sometimes a sacrifice happens to avoid the messiness. I'm not saying it's right. Another issue in terms of real-world stuff and diversity, including, for example, authentic clips of things, other kinds of images, literature, things like that, is the increasing problem of rights, of getting rights from other authors or pictures and stuff like that. And because that's becoming more and more difficult with materials being digital and being put online, the easiest thing is to use a stock photo or something which doesn't require asking for permission, so inventing it, instead of asking and trying to get more authenticity and real-world diversity in there. And the other one, and I think this is really unfortunate, is that in some places there becomes a backlash. And this is very true of textbooks, where I've lived in Canada and the UK, in Spain to an extent lesser, I think in America for sure, in the States, is an idea that textbooks, if they become very diverse in a sense of politically correct, people start getting a backlash against that. They say this is unrealistic, or it's tokenistic, or I don't like this. And there's a lot of that going on now, a backlash against what is perceived as politically correct. Again, I think that is I don't think we should pay attention to it so much, but it's there. So what are possible solutions? I haven't made this clear, explicit, but I'm going to now. I think that ELT materials still have a long way to go before they are as diverse as I personally, as a teacher, would like to see them. I don't think we are going as far as we could. Is the solution diversity of publishing? We have fewer and fewer publishers. There used to be far more publishers, both in the UK and in the States and abroad. There is more of a tendency for bigger publishers to eat smaller publishers and so on. So should we be looking more to develop local publishing? Should we be pushing global publishers to do more? Or, as the solution was once suggested around 10 years ago, the idea of glocal, which is a global book with local editions. Okay, that's one thing. The other thing is, and this is about the authenticity problem, is we insist on the real world in the classroom when it isn't real. So this is looking at the classroom as a real world, and the classroom as a place to simulate other worlds. So we're always pretending other things and bringing other things out, where I think also some of these diversity things can be adapted by recognizing the classroom as a real world. And some of those tasks that we think are not real world, some of the more inauthentic tasks, actually work really well in a classroom. Doing simulations and role plays in a classroom allow for other diversity to come in. We don't always have to pretend that we're outside of the classroom. The purpose of the classroom is to practice, to learn, to go out in the real world. It's not to be the real world, necessarily, I don't think. And finally, do we need more writer diversity? And so this is where I have to, if I'm being critical about things, I have to go all the way. A lot of the writers of our textbooks are BANA. They're from North America, Australia. Do we need, I think, if we really truly want to have diversity, we need to encourage more local writers. We need to encourage more non-native writers, more voices. Maybe what we need is fewer people that look like this. I'd like to just finish with this quote that I heard from a colleague of mine who I'm sure all of you recognize the name. If I tell you, Mario Winvalucri, who once made the most elegant statement that I think, and I think it really does apply to materials, to teaching, and like this idea of inclusion, diversity, and so on. He once told me, he said, Lindsay, teaching English is a how, it's not a what. And I think the what is therefore up to us. Thank you very much. There are references here to some of the works that I cited. This will be available on the JALT website.